Welcome. I'm Steve Winnick from the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and I'll be chatting with Walter Parks in an oral history interview related to his Homegrown at Home concert, which he recorded for us earlier this year, and you can watch that at loc.gov. So, Walter, let's begin by just talking about your background a little bit, where you're from and how you got started in music.
Well, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, which is the northeast part of Florida. It's very swampy and marshy, and I tell you, I've been all over the world, but that area of the world is prettier than anything I've ever seen. So I grew up in those parts, and I as is required by most young men in their teens, I was compelled to play sports and those sorts of things. But sports were they didn't hook me like music did. And I was coming up in the era of Woodstock and Jimi Hendrix and Jefferson Airplane and Richie Havens and artists like that. And I wanted to be a part of that, but I had, for some reason, I was just, in retrospect, I was just quarantined. I had no idea how to find a rock and roll band in Jacksonville, Florida, or something like that. So the closest that I could get was the school orchestra, and I started playing viola. So that was my first instrument, and I just succumbed to the peer pressure that viola was absolutely not cool, and I had to put that down after a couple of years, and then picked up the guitar and kind of started finding my own identity through the guitar rather than sports. And I'm very happy I made that decision.
Yeah, so you're really a guitarist first and foremost, I guess, in the music world.
Yeah, and I've kind of fallen in love with singing more lately at this part of my life. If you zoom out and you look at my whole time with music, I taught myself to sing years after I taught myself to play the guitar, and I had to learn how to sing in order to play at people's weddings to make a living. And I'm the kind of guy that'll say, "Yep, I can do it. I'll be there. Tell me what time," and I just figure out how to do it after I make the commitment. And it's worked out good. When I first started singing for weddings or in a rock and roll band, I was blowing my voice out, and I had nothing to give after one evening. The first evening would be great, and if I had 4 nights to play in a row of 4-hour gigs, I had nothing. I mean, I was hurting myself. So I found a lady who was a Juilliard opera teacher, and she taught me voice through Italian arias. So I learned how to save my voice by studying in a classic methodology. But there was a problem with that, because when you sing, when everything is Il dolce tormento, when you sing everything like that, then when it comes time to sing Born to Run or whatever by Springsteen, you don't know how to sing that. So it was up to me to try to figure out how to translate and bridge those two worlds. But I did save my voice, and then I found out how to project and to have my voice last. I can sing. I could sing 12 gigs, 12 nights in a row, 3-hour shows if I need to. And that's just because I learned how to pace myself. But it's been a very, very interesting and for the most part, delightful journey with music, with the guitar and with voice.
Sure. And so let's talk about a couple of your sort of musical projects that you became known for before you started doing this work. And I guess we can start with the Nudes.
Yeah,
which was an interesting duo that you were in for a long time.
Well, Stephen, I had when I lived in Jacksonville, Florida, as a young adult, I always dreamt of moving to New York City. And when I got to New York City, I'd saved up some money, but I realized that having a rock and roll band in New York was logistically a nightmare. You have to have a place to rehearse, and the rehearsal costs so much money per hour. I wasn't used to any of that stuff in Jacksonville, Florida. So I said, oh, I can't bear this. And so I want to have an acoustic group that's just simple. I want to get back a little bit and mix my classical training with the acoustic guitar and folk music that I was kind of starting to get into. So I placed an ad in the Village Voice looking for a cellist. And a woman named Stephanie Winters answered the ad, and we were off and running for 10 years. We traveled all over Canada and the United States, and we had a good run of it through in the folk realm, you know, festivals like the Falcon Ridge Folk Festival and those sorts of festivals all over the country. We would eventually sign up with a booking agent who was also Richie Havens' booking agent. Mm-hmm. And so we got the opportunity to open for Richie Havens a lot. And that's kind of how I met him. And later on, I would end up playing with him. But it was mostly just out of the necessity to survive in New York City as to why I put an ad for just a cellist, and we were just an acoustic duo, and it was out of the need to just survive and keep my music out there, but do it in a practical way.
So did your background as a previous viola player influence your decision to look for a cellist?
Yeah, it did, because I knew the power of that extended melody. And when you've got a guitar that's just going, that kind of a vibe, and if you've got, I loved how they kind of laced together. And so also another thing is that because I studied viola, I knew how to speak with a classical musician.
Right.
When I was a kid and dealing with rock and roll bands, there's this ethic of, in rock and roll, there's this ethic of, just throw it at me. I'll deal with it. Whatever you want me to do, I'll deal with it. You want me to play where I can't hear myself? That's fine. Let's go for it. It's too loud for me. It's uncomfortable. Let's go for it. But in classical music, classical musicians are used to a certain level of comfort. And that is the prerequisite to them doing a good job. And, it's easy to label classical musicians as prima donnas and so on. But when you realize how much concentration and how much relaxation you have to have in order to deliver that music, you begin to understand that a lot of times what we deem as diva-esque behavior or prima donna-esque behavior is just a desire to focus on the music and that wonderful connection that is enabled by relaxing. And so I was able to bridge those two worlds of rock and roll and blues and so on with the classical world, because I think I started playing viola. So,
right. Yeah. Well, it's always good to have different musical experiences to fall back on when you're charting new territory. It gives you more resources, and that's key. Yeah. So you mentioned Richie Havens, of course, as an act that you shared a manager with and then opened for a lot. And then, of course, you moved over to playing with Richie. So talk about that experience.
Well, when I was a kid in 1969 and 1970, I guess, when the movie for Woodstock came out, I would go to the music store, and this is how you experienced a musical phenomenon back then. You couldn't go to YouTube and say, let me find out the way it went down. You'd go to a music store and look at the sheet music for it first. Can you imagine experiencing Woodstock via the sheet music? Right. and trying to get the vibe of Woodstock? But that's all I had.
Yeah.
But before I could really go into clubs and see this phenomenon, that was not available to me in the town in which I lived. So I would see these pictures of Jimi Hendrix and Richie Havens, and I remember just being absorbed by Richie Havens in his golden robe and that long beard that, oddly enough, kind of is about like mine at this point.
Right.
He looked like some kind of an African king, and he sounded like, when you finally saw the Woodstock movie, he sounded like all the world's music in one man. And I was, Stephen, this guy epitomized completeness of a solo act. And that's what I wanted to have. I didn't want to necessarily look like him or act like him, but I wanted to figure out what was the secret of his completeness. And it would be years later that when I finally got to know Richie as to what that actual mystery was. But fast forward, so that was my enticement with him initially, was just through the Woodstock sheet music. Right. And then, you know, I'm going to take this moment to just say, when you think something in life is just beyond your capability of understanding or beyond your reach, the light should go off that maybe you need to rethink that. Because when I first saw those pictures of Richie Havens and the images of him playing at Woodstock, I thought, I am here in this theater in Jacksonville, Florida, and these gods, if you will, are somewhere else, and we shall never meet. You know, there's always going to be this chasm of mystery between us and unattainability. And I'm here to tell you, so many times in my life, along the path of my story, I have realized that one needs to keep oneself in check when you think something is unattainable. Because I can fast forward to my very last days of playing with Richie Havens, and I started at the beginning my enticement with him in the very last days when it was evident that Richie, because of a condition that he was developing that would eventually retire him, did not have that magic anymore. And it was very sad in one sense, but wonderful in the other sense, because as it became more and more difficult for him to remember his lyrics and to orient himself, still two things were intact: his delivery and his connection. He still had that flow. He still had that wonderful gallop to his playing style. And you know, like that here comes the sun. That was all there. You know, you could still do this. Freedom, freedom, that kind of thing. And the other thing that was still intact, the lyrics might have fallen by the wayside here or there, but the other thing that was intact was his love for people and their love for him. And it was wonderful to see that forgiveness and that support from the audience, in spite of them knowing that he was challenged at the very end. And so in between, now I'll go back to the in between of my time with him. But I will say that when the time came for Richie to look for he needed another guitarist. He'd always had a kind of a solo guitarist behind his music. And I tell you, when I got asked to come audition for that, because I thought he was all the world's music in one man and so complete, I asked myself, what can I bring to this picture? How do I deserve to sit at this table? And, you know, for for a couple of months, I just floundered around, just trying to figure out how to not get in his way and how to contribute to it. And Richie at one point could sense that I was kind of searching and struggling. I got the gig, by the way, because I think Richie was just familiar with me. He felt good about me. He knew I was a good musician, but he was comfortable with me from having opened for him for so many years.
Right.
And that was why they called me. They knew about me because of that, my connection with the Nudes.
Yeah, well, it's important. Like someone that you can work with just interpersonally is so important. So
absolutely. And Richie knew that I could communicate with him. He knew that I understood him, and I'll get to that in a second.
Mm-hmm.
But it's you know, when I was first trying to figure out how to play with him, he said, "Look, it boils down to this. I want our two guitars, your guitar, Walter, and my guitar, to sound like one guitar." And when he told me that, I realized I had to go in a different direction than what he was going in, but yet I needed to weave with him.
Right.
So I started to lean back on my Southern roots and my banjo picking style that I had developed from living in the area where the Okefenokee Swamp is. So I started leaning back on my roots at that point, to save my job, but it was also the most natural place for me to go. In other words, when I realized I needed to head towards what I knew best, and what I knew best was where I came from. And that was something that Richie couldn't say. Richie didn't come from the swamp like I did. He came from Brooklyn. So right. What I had to do is to bring this kind of southern, southeast Georgia, northeast Florida swampy vibe to his thing, but not overcome it. He didn't hire me to be a swamp guitar player. He hired me to give him a sense of comfort on stage so that he wouldn't have to do the heavy lifting constantly. And so that I could do a fill here or then when he needed a break from his singing. That's what he hired me for. But at the end of the day, in the quest of trying to blend with him and sound like one guitar player, I just leaned on my banjo picking style. And so Richie's going, and I'm going, that kind of thing. Is my foot tapping too much for the mic? Is it breaking up is it distorting it, or is it okay? Can you hear that okay? So you can hear how that's a banjo kind of style. Can you hear that from me playing?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, all right, great. So in other words, if he's going, "Here comes the sun," in and of itself, that kind of sounds like, "Oh, where's the beat?" You know, I can't find one in that. But when you combine that with, it sounds wonderful and just weaves together. So that's how I got my gig and how I sort of saved my gig. And it went on for 10 years with Richie Havens. And it was a wonderful trip around the world, so to speak. And it was all, I learned so much about what doing a job was when you serve somebody or when you serve anything. And I can remember one of my first couple of gigs, we were playing at the Edmonton Folk Festival up in Alberta. It was the first time I'd played for like 20,000 people in one hit or something like that. And I was kind of all into the moment as, wow, here I am on stage with Richie Havens and look at all these people and what do I look like? You know, I'm thinking all of this rubbish that didn't have anything to do with what my job was. And I just realized that at one point I was so nervous my fingers would hardly work. And this is early on in the gig before I came to the epiphany. It's like, no. My job is to look to my left and keep my eye on Richie Havens I don't need to be worrying about how I look or how many people are out there, or what country I'm in, or how high the stage is, or any of that. My job is to focus on the reason for why I'm here, which is Richie Havens, and the pathway, that pathway and that sense of attachment is so meaningful that it took care of everything else. So in other words, how I sounded, how I was coming across, how I might have looked, all of that was fine once I realized how to do my job. Mm-hmm. So that's just a little piece of experience that has helped me to get through other situations. I quickly identify who or what I'm supposed to serve. And it can be, if I'm producing a record for somebody, it's, if they want me to provide ambience or something underneath their song, my job is not to come in and say, well, you need to have the verse, it's got too many verses here. If they are hiring me for the particular atmospheres that I can bring to a record, I got to stick to the darn atmospheres. I don't need to get involved in anything else. And once I establish myself, that we can expand. But so expand I did with Richie, and boy, it the job, if you will, morphed from being just a solo guitar or a lead guitar player in the background on what he did to I ended up being his road manager, and I speak French, so when we traveled to Europe, that came in handy. And I got we traveled all over the place, and I could do business in countries that had Spain and Italy and France, anything like that, I could kind of survive in and make Richie's life easier in. And at the very end, I mean, I was driving the band in certain places. Occasionally we had a road manager, but sometimes I'd be driving across different countries and handling the money and dealing with the music and dealing with the PA company. It was a tremendous experience. And all of that was possible because I love presenting concerts and in the whole picture. Since I've been a kid, I've been fascinated with big festivals like Woodstock. I've been fascinated by how they're put on, how they're marketed, how they sound, how you get people out to them. And so just with being with Richie Havens, it was a wonderful experience. And I'll tell you, can I tell one story about taking Richie?
Absolutely.
Here's another little lesson. It's like if what I'm passionate about as an aspect of life, or in this case, aspect of music, is not necessarily what everybody else is passionate about, but that's one of the wonderful things about humanity. I can remember when we were on the road, if we had a day off, I would take Richie to see all these old venues. I would say, I'm just going to pull something out. I'd say, Richie, this is where the band Free played on their first tour, or this is the Dane County Coliseum in Madison, Wisconsin. This is where Pink Floyd opened their Dark Side of the Moon tour. Richie, isn't this amazing? And, he could care less, And I remember one day I took him to the Monterey Fairgrounds, because in 1967, that's where Jimi Hendrix cracked open. And I don't know who else was there. I think the Mamas and the Papas, maybe. The Who, I think, came on that night. And but I would we'd have the day off or the afternoon off, and I'd say, Richie, you want to go see a gig? And he'd go, yeah, because he was just sitting around in the hotel room. So I remember the Monterey State Fairgrounds were wide open. They normally have, cattle shows and blue ribbon contests and so on at this place, but there was a gate that was open that took you right into the fairgrounds. And if y'all look at see, I'm getting excited just talking about this. If you look at the the movie, and the grandstand, the roof of the grandstand is got a bunch of points, one point after the other, going all around the state fairgrounds. So we were driving in the middle of that. We kind of felt like a matador in the middle of a bullfight ring. Here we are just driving through it. We're in 1967, thousands of people were sitting and watching Jimi Hendrix, and and Richie was just like, wow. He wasn't infused with, because that was a part of his life. I think the following year in 68, he would end up playing there. And venues for Richie were just a kind of a tool, just like old guitars, and, they just didn't have the attachment and the folklore that they did for me. And the reason was he lived it, he lived it. And for me, I read about it and I watched it in movies, but Richie just lived it. I'm looking around for a guitar that I want to show you. I don't know if it's up here, but I have one of Richie's old guitars, and maybe I'll take a second break and go grab that. No, it's not here. Oh, well, that I've got one of his old guitars with me. But anyway, so that's a story of supporting him and playing with him for so many years, and I learned most importantly that the name of the game is connection with people. And Richie took great pains after a concert to hang out and meet everybody who wanted to meet him. But during the concert, he always gave you the feeling that he was there for you and you only. If you were listening, it didn't matter if you were on the last row in the auditorium. He had this way of, he would get in real close to the mic. He would say, and that's how you can tell that the moon knows more than you do, or something like that. He actually never said that, but that was what he would do. He would get in real close, and it was as if he was right there on your ear, But that was not bad. That's something like he might have said.
Right.
But I want to say one more thing about my time with Richie, unless you have other questions about it. But I think one of the reasons I stayed on with him for so long was that I could speak his language and I understood his language. Richie did not talk in terms of music. And I remember early on, I almost got fired because, I would make a chord like, I don't know, this is an E flat major 7. Now, who cares? Nobody cares about that. Richie certainly didn't care about that, but that's the first chord of the Who's See Me, Feel Me. Not that we played that, but if we were playing that, I would say, oh, Richie, that's a major 7 chord. You just need to go to, you need to go to the F suspended chord. And then, and all of this. And I thought he wanted to know that. He didn't care about that. He called these kind of chords a mystery chord. So when I figured that he had these psychedelic hippie babble names for all of these college chords, as I call them, then I realized, I need to change my language up a little bit with him. And I realized that he spoke in terms of effect. He spoke in terms of the musical effect that he eventually wanted that chord to have on his audience. And at the end of the day, that's as legitimate as knowing that this is an E flat major 7 chord. As a matter of fact, the fact that that's an E flat major 7 chord is just something that I've laboriously put into my head, and I'm proud that I can recall that and affix that to that. But really, what does that matter? You don't get up on a microphone and go, E flat major 7, F sharp suspended, or F suspended, G suspended, G dominant 7. Nobody cares. They care about how it makes them feel. And Richie understood that from the very get-go, because he came up through doo-wop on the streets of Brooklyn. He came up understanding how the different notes in the chord, 4 notes of which, because each voice sang a note of every chord in the doo-wop band on the streets of Brooklyn. And that's how he learned music, is the effect that it had on people. And that's what I learned from Richie Havens. If I learned nothing else, is that there has to be a connection with the listener that is not intellectual. And I mean that from respect. I don't mean that from disrespect. I mean that it's deeper because it's not intellectual. And so anyway, that's my little story about Richie Havens.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how some of the standard sort of music theory terms for chords and musical relationships actually refer to the way it makes you feel, like the dominant chord.
Suspended.
Suspended, right? All those,
right.
And yet, that in order to make sure that you can reproduce the exact same chord, you have to be more precise, and that's where the theoretical precision comes in. So
right that is a very that's insightful, and I never quite thought of the dominant seventh aspect, but that's very cool. Yeah, you're giving me something to think about there. I love that. So.
All right. Well, so I mean, it's just great to hear about your time with Richie because of the sort of figure that he was. But we want to talk also about the great film and homegrown concert that you put together for us.
Thank you. And
start by talking a little bit about the collection that you used from the American Folklife Center's archive.
This is there's a certain irony to me searching for what y'all have in the archives, and that I just had this idea that when I came to the conclusion that my own roots were going to have to play an integral part in me surviving in music, before I even listened to the American Folklife collection, when I came to the conclusion that I needed to lean into my roots, because that was my best hope of being unique and finding my own little irreplaceability, so to speak. When I came to that conclusion, I had this thought that maybe there was some music made out there. I mean, nobody told me that there was music. I'd gone camping in the Okefenokee and loved it, but my whole time in Boy Scouts, Stephen, Boy Scouts, it was one of the biggest deals of the year to go out camping in the Okefenokee. Mm-hmm. And we would do it maybe twice a year. And we would talk to the rangers and everything, and, go to the visitor center, and then we'd go off on our own. You don't really go off on your own in the Okefenokee anymore. You have to have a guide. But back then, the times when you had a guide, nothing was said about music. It was all about alligators and the alligator, the business and the logging business, and nobody talked about the music. I found that out for myself, and I have to say that I want to drive home the point that there is a small trove of music that is in the American Folklife collection that pertains to the library, pertains to the Okefenokee Swamp. It's not vast. I mean, it's maybe 28 or 30 little song bits. But, well, I want to say this. When I first started listening to the collection, I'm going like, what am I going to do with 30 songs? This is gonna be I've come a long way to follow the gold at the end of this rainbow, and there's not that much gold in this pot. And I thought, at first I was bummed out. And I tell you, lesson number 2 here is that when you think that, don't let yourself be misled by quantity when you first start doing research. Just dig into what you can find, and it's going to lead to other things. And that's what happened with my research on the music of the Okefenokee. and I kind of companioned that research with some books that were written, very few books. One is by a man named Professor Delma Presley, who teaches or used to teach at Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, Georgia. And I want to mention right now that if y'all get a chance to see the piece that I did for the American Folklife Collection, I mistakenly said that he used to teach at Georgia State University. That's in Atlanta. To Georgia people, this makes a big difference. And to all of my friends in Georgia, please forgive me. This was an important piece of archiving to do for the Library of Congress, and I took it very seriously, and I was a little bit nervous at that moment. I just made that little mistake, and I feel bad about it. But anyway,
we forgive you.
Okay. Well, thank you. But so one thing led to another. I read a little bit about this guy in the book named Hamp Mizell, whose family did some of the singing in the Shape Notes singing in the library, in the American Folklife Collection, but yet Hamp was never recorded in the American Folklife Collection. So, but he was referred to in one of these books. So I had to find the closest version to it in another recording. My point is that I started to put all the pieces together just because I had a little information that I originally got from the Library of Congress. And one thing led to the other. And in trying to do a thorough job of it, sometimes you go down rabbit holes, you know. And I remember there was this song that was referred to called Catfish. And even in y'all's collection, there is a picture of Hamp Mizell, I think, playing fiddle, I believe. But I know that it's Hamp Mizell because I've seen that the shape of that human being identified in a book. But in the movie, it doesn't say it's Hamp Mizell. But there's no sound to it.
Right.
So it's just a movie of all these people kind of doing what they call a frolic on Sunday, and they're all in their Sunday bests and they're just playing music. So two things came to mind there. I realized what musicians were involved and how this likely was to have sounded. So I looked for other types of groups that had that same configuration: fiddle, banjo, and maybe acoustic guitar. So what were some of the other groups that might have been recorded in the South around that same time? And I found something in Charleston, South Carolina, that gave me the song, the sound of the song, and then I put the lyrics. Then I got the lyrics from a book about the Okefenokee, and then once I put the song and the melody together with the lyrics from the book about the Okefenokee, then I recorded it for my piece with you guys. Mm-hmm. So it was just because, so I used those 3 points. I used the visual from your film. I used the lyrics from the book that Mr. Presley wrote, and some other music that I'd found from some a group called the Poplin Family Singers out of Charleston, South Carolina. So that came from the Smithsonian Folkways. But sometimes with research, you gotta hit it from all points. So I took this music, and one song after another, I would try to ask myself exactly what I asked when I got hired to play with Richie Havens. What can I bring to this table? This music has already been recorded in 1944, 1945, and it's been archived, thankfully, by you guys, the Library of Congress. Now, who am I to come along in 2020 and do anything with that that's going to be meaningful? And so what I decided is I wanted to try to put a little contemporary twist with it. I might play it with an electric guitar, or I might just want to give it a little contemporary beat, a little lift. Or in the case of spiritual music, like what they used to sing when they were at a frolic and they were all sitting facing each other for a shape note singing. I took it to a church. There was a church that I was nice enough to let me use their stairwell, and I sang one of the hollers, note for note, in the stairwell of a church in St. Louis, and it was a wonderful sound. You could hear it on the piece that I did for you guys. That's the first piece that I start with. Now, my point is, I took this and I wrote out what I found in your collection. I wrote out the music that was sung by a man named Tom Chesser. I wrote that out note for note, and I re-sang it. And I did it with a little bit of my own style. I did it in a scenario that was different than in the swamp. And so it has a little bit of it has a totally different effect. And here's my overarching point. Because of my studies, my early studies of opera, and because of what I knew of classical music from the study of viola, and because of the spiritual power that I knew this music to be inspired by what created this music, I decided I'm going to try to sing this in a church rather than out in the wilderness. Now, there are films that I submitted to you guys of me singing these hollers in the woods because I wanted people to hear that echo. But I also, just for the sake of doing something different with it, I sang it in the church. Now, I want to be clear. My intent was not to be, I have no spiritual or religious agenda with this. I just wanted to put it in a situation that, in a sort of a spiritual situation that inspired the song in the first place. Now I'm referring there to the song Idumea, which I sang with an acoustic guitar in a little chapel, also in St. Louis. But I think those hollers, which were sung by people, well, let me back up. There was the main type of music that you have in your collection that really magnetized me were hollers. There was also Appalachian style music, banjos, and I've kind of covered that. And there was also shape note singing, which is spiritual, and I've covered that. But the hollers were a practical way of communicating. If a man had been off in the woods hunting for 3 days, and you've got a 600 square mile swamp, it's easy to go out for 3 days. And if you come back on your house without some kind of notice, you're likely to get shot at because you're coming out of the woods. Nobody knows when you're coming back. If you let them know a mile out, if you're a mile away from your house and you give a, I'm not in good voice right now, you give your characteristic holler, and they know, okay, all right, Bill's been out, he's okay. That's Bill. He'll be here in about an hour, because the sound would travel through the pines for about a mile. And because of my affinity, my magnetism to my passion for those classical and operatic sounds, these things they had that power, that operatic power to me. And, when folks do, hollering is today reproduced and sung, and people win Blue Ribbon Awards for it. And it's all kind of presented like with fiddle music and banjos and folk music in Western North Carolina and so on. And that's all well and good, but this stuff sounded operatic to me. It sounded glorious. It sounded a little spiritual. Now, I want to be real clear. The guys who were singing this music, they didn't think of it as music at all. This was practical communication to them. And it was just like us using cell phones now. Hey, I'll be home in 10 minutes. Anything, can I pick up some eggs or something? That's the way they were. That's what hollering was, Woo, that meant, okay, I've got a dead deer on my back. I'll be there in a couple of minutes. Get the fire on. Let's boil the hide or do whatever we got to do with it, And so this was not considered music. This was a tool to them. And so along comes me in 2020, and I turn it into music. And I was fortunate enough to connect with a man named Wade Chesser, who in your collection, I don't know if I told you this, but maybe I did, but in your collection, oh boy, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I want to show you. I don't know if I have it. I want to show you. Well, I've got an old letter that Wade Chesser wrote me. I wrote Wade Chesser, and he wrote me back. Wade Chesser, on your tape, on the tape that you have in the Library of Congress, he is introduced as, now we'll hear one of the old-fashioned songs. This is the Coming Home Holler by 17-year-old Wade Chesser. And he's performing the Coming Home Holler interspersed with a few of the old-fashioned songs. I think that's almost the wording exactly. Mm-hmm. And so I was told by Delma Presley, the professor at Georgia Southern, that this Wade Chesser guy is still alive. And you gotta chase him down. So I did. I wrote him. Most of his adult life, he had been a bank executive in a town in the middle of Georgia. And I wrote him. He had since retired. He wrote me back, and when he wrote me back, he was at the tail end of his life. He wrote me back in very scribbled hand. I'm pretty sure I was probably one of the last letters he ever wrote. He passed away, but he wrote me back. He said, well, I this is so odd that you're singing this music in auditoriums. And we just thought of this as bringing the cows home or letting our family know we were coming home from a hunt. And he says, I wish you luck with your project. I can't help you with it because I'm an old feeble man at this point, but I wish you luck with the project. It wasn't that he was being discouraging to me. It was just that it was perplexing to him. So because of your connection, because of your collection, I connected with this man. And, honestly, I can't say that I got his blessing to do it. I don't even think he was thinking that way, or I wasn't asking for a blessing. I was just letting him know I'm doing this. And I wanted to know more about it. And I did get to meet his brother, who's still alive. And these guys, I tried to do whatever I could to get his brother, who's younger, to sing a holler. And he's also preserved in your archives. That's just a part of that's a bygone part of their life. They're not any more going to do a holler now than anybody. They'll talk about their days when they were working in corporate America or something like that. And when they moved to the big city, Jacksonville nearby, I don't want to hear about that. I want to hear about the hollers. I want to hear about how they lived out in the swamp. They got out of the swamp. They're glad to be out of the swamp. But here are guys like you and me who are impassioned by the tale and the lore of these guys living in the middle of nowhere and making the best of it. And they don't really want to go down memory lane. But I tell you, I've tried, and but they have given their blessing to me, and they've come to my concerts when I play in that area of the country. It's really great. It's fascinating to have a person who was recorded in 1945 and is forever preserved in your archives in the Library of Congress, American Folklife Collection. And that individual has come to my shows probably in the year 2018 and seen me perform. And whereas I'm much better about my performances are much better now in the year 2020, especially after I've prepared for what I submitted to y'all. But I passed the test, and even in 2018, I entertained him enough. So the first thing Mr. Bill Chesser said to me is, I was nervous when I met him. He said, he leaned in, he got in real close to me. He says, "Can you yodel? Can you yodel?" And because yodeling is that's what hollering is
right.
There we go. That's actually a yodel. And this brings to mind one other quick thing that I want to, a little side road that I want to go down that's actually kind of crucial. If you wouldn't mind me doing this. Part of the reason I so stubbornly resisted anything to do with the swamp as what defined me in my early days of performing, in my early quest for uniqueness and style when I moved to New York City, is because I was one of two types of Southerners. I was brought up, for better or for worse, there were kind of two mentalities of white Southerners, and I can't speak for any other cultures or races because I'm not that. But with white Southerners, you were either came from the working class or you came from something else. And you might have had farmland, and if your people had farmland, then there might have been connected, for better or for worse, to the plantation economy and that reality. Again, for better or for worse, the grand disclaimer, I was in the latter. My people had farms, and they probably had plantations, and I know they had plantations, and they probably, if you trace it back far enough, they probably had slaves. Not happy about that, but my point is, I had this feeling of disdain for anything that related to fiddles, banjos, yodeling, all of that. And I talked to my friends in North Carolina not too long ago when I first started this research. And I have a good friend named Landon Walker who now lives in Greensboro, North Carolina, and he's got a brother who runs a Walker family traditional music camp in up around Boone, North Carolina, or Blowing Rock or something like that. Anyway, it's string music. It's traditional North Carolinian music. And I was talking to him about his family history with it, and the light went off when I talked. He said, "No, we didn't like that music. My father had nothing to do with this. We listened to classical music." Mm-hmm. And I realized I never listened to it either. I grew up in the South. I never once listened to string music, folk music, banjo music, yodels, none of it. It was considered low class. Mm-hmm. And we didn't listen to classical music, but we listened to what they called beautiful music, or Henry Mancini and all of that stuff. That's what I grew up on. Perry Como, Andy Williams. And we would not be caught dead listening to folk music. And so I got on the folk train much later in my life, ironically, when I moved to New York City. My point in all of this is to say, it's been a struggle, even through my research in the Library of Congress collection, to accept that this music was part of me. Mm-hmm. And I've kind of felt like it's been a real growing process for me, because for some reason, I could always play this music well. It was always part of me in the sense that it flowed out of me easily. And when I moved to New York City, and I thought of myself as all European connected and everything, and my German friends and my Japanese friends would keep saying to me, "Oh, you have such a swampy vibe in your playing." I'm like, "Oh, geez, I can't hear that one more time. I want to be, all, I just want to be as modern and cutting edge as possible. Don't tell me about the swamp." Finally, the light went off. I've got to embrace it. Once again, I'm trying to bring this back around to your roots is that's your life preserver. If you're an artist and you want to find your unique voice, you have to turn and embrace your roots. Right. If you run from them, you are fighting an uphill battle that you will probably never win. And I have to say, this Library of Congress adventure for me has been life-shaping. I mean, it was, for me to get this music back into my psyche, into my genes, if you will, was was in a certain way healing, and it was a certain way enlightening. Now you might say, "What you just got through telling us that this wasn't in your genes. This is you listen to classical music and Henry Mancini, and that may be what I was supposed to be listening to, but for some reason, I related to this music in a deeper way, and I had to accept it in order to perform it correctly." Mm-hmm. And even if you look at my first versions that I made in like 2016 of me in a theater in Jersey City, mm-hmm. I'm singing a holler like, I'm singing it operatically, mm-hmm. not I'm not kind of really owning the yodel part of it.
Right.
God forbid I actually yodel, because then that's accepting that I work the land. I'm going back to my upbringing and so on. But it's been a journey that y'all have helped me with. And I feel like I'm authorized to do this, and I'm authorized to do it because I used to spend so much time out there in the swamp. What I'm not authorized to do is to talk about the history of the Okefenokee. If y'all want that, you go to a book and you read that. But what I can talk about is the music that was made out there. And that's what I can also play. And I think I do it pretty well now. And what's really kind of supportive and encouraging to me is I can remember the first time I heard your collection, and I first started writing it out, Stephen. It'd take me too long in the books to show you the first page.
Right.
I first started writing this down. I scribbled it out in hand before I put it into a music program. And I just started shaking, and I just started shaking. I could barely write, and I was in New York City at the time. And I'm like, this is crazy. I'm writing this music that came from Washington, D.C. Well, it first came from the archives. I mean, it first came from the field in the Okefenokee Swamp.
Yeah.
It was archived by Francis Harper on equipment on loan from you guys, sat in the Library of Congress American Folklife collection for years, then was loaned a little bit of it, some of it, to the Georgia Southern University, which I first heard it. And now I took it to New York City, and I'm writing it out, and I'm shaking. I'm going like, nobody's ever done this before with this piece of music. I don't even know that people have really listened to this little bit of music probably in 30 years. Who knows? And it was just the import of it, in that I realized I was going to be a bridge to this for some people who would never otherwise hear this, and believe me, I am patting myself on the back and saying, all right, this is important. I did something that's worthwhile, but I have had people come up to me. I mean, the proof is in what people say to me after my shows. It's like, well, I've had men come up to me in tears. I remember I played at the Stephen C. Foster Park in Northeast Florida, Live Oak, Florida. There's a festival there called the Magnolia Fest, I think is what it is. It's a folk festival. And there was a gentleman who came up in tears. He goes, I haven't heard that since my grandfather used to holler, and it sounded just like him. I go, yeah, because it's from this area. It's from this neck of the woods. We're on the Suwannee River. I said, the Suwannee River starts up in the Okefenokee. That's where the spring is for it. It all comes from this area. And he was in tears, and he says, I want more of this. And now when people come to me after shows, I can say, well, there's a whole review of it. There's a whole show that I did for the Library of Congress. And because of the COVID, this is being recorded in 2020, and we're still in the middle of a coronavirus epidemic. I've not performed any live concerts. So I haven't been able to say to anybody at this point, there's a whole the fruits of my efforts are compiled in the Library of Congress collection, the Library of Congress American Folklife collection. You just have to find it online. And so now I can say that, and I can't wait to do that live on tour.
It's great. But, you know, one of the things that we found really interesting about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it affected our concert series was that, you know, we had to retool very quickly and create our concert series to be online. And that gave artists like yourself more free reign to do things that they couldn't do live in the Coolidge Auditorium. And for some of the concerts, including yours, we think that that actually ended up being a real asset, because one of the things that we love about your video particularly is the sense of place that we get out of the fact that you actually went to the swamp and to the Chesser homestead to record some of these songs. So could you talk about that, about your literal journey? When you
that was there. That took place. My pilgrimage was twofold. I go there. I go there I stop by the Okefenokee just about any time I'm in that neck of the woods. But I went there specifically for this project that I submitted to you all once, and then there was also one time before that I filmed. I got myself up at 5 in the morning and went out to the Okefenokee. Now, when you see the piece that I've done for you all, there's a song called Ain't Nobody's Business. It starts with a holler. It's all black backdrop. I'm playing a Fender guitar, and you'll see a film in the background of me. Now, that's a film that I took on a canoe in the Okefenokee Swamp. That didn't come from stock footage. You know, that came from me holding my camera as my canoe drifted through the Okefenokee. And that was about 7:30 in the morning, one October. And the coolness of the air, the frost in the air was meeting the warmness of that water. And it was just exquisite. I can't believe I kept the camera as still as I did, because I was just inside. I was shaking with the majesty of it. And what I did is I underlaid that behind me playing. So that's actual footage. And I don't think I'm pretty sure that I didn't mention that in the Library of Congress film that I made for you all, but that was my footage that I overlaid under me playing. Amazing. So that was trip number one. Trip number two, I specifically made for you guys. And I went to the Chesser homestead in July, a month before I released the film to you all. And I'm sitting there. I've never had Mother Nature put me under such pressure to do a recording project as Mother Nature was doing. It was hot as it's hot as hell out there. And it was in the swamp in July. And not only that, what you didn't realize is that mosquitoes were just going crazy. And I was fighting mosquitoes and the heat. And I'm from that area, and I could barely take it. But every now and then I would be sitting there on the porch. And at one point I had the place all to myself. It's the beautiful Chesser homestead. There's the sand. Now, a lot of people don't understand, you know, you're talking about a homestead in the middle of the swamp. If you've never been out to a swamp, you don't realize there are islands in a swamp. It's not just all water and alligators and water moccasins. There are little islands where people lived and they had livestock, and they different families had different islands. That's the way it worked in the Okefenokee. When I went down there to the Chesser Island and the Chesser homestead, they gave me permission to walk up there and film on the front porch. And I took my 1929 banjo, and I did that because I wanted it to be an instrument that would have been played in the period when people were living out there. So I played that song Catfish that Delma Presley refers to in his book, The Okefenokee Album. And so when I'm sitting there on the porch by myself, I'm sitting there playing, and I'm kind of into. You don't know this because you're watching it from the perspective of the camera, But I get through play and I can't play it because it's in a different tuning right now. But I'm playing and I look up and there's 10 people there watching me, and I get finished playing, and they said, "Can you tell me a little bit about the house? And can we go into the house?" In fact, the house was closed. They were doing some repairs on the road, and nobody was really supposed to be back there. But apparently, they had gotten the tree had fallen across the road, and they had opened it up. Now the tourists are there. Now, what they think I am, they think I'm a costume guide, like you see Ponce de Leon walking around in St. Augustine, Florida. Right. You know, they think I'm a prop. They think I'm just like in Williamsburg, Virginia, or something. You know, but no, I'm out there doing research, and as a matter of fact, a couple of my takes were ruined because people would start clapping. I wanted it to kind of seem like I was really authentically out there in the middle of nowhere, and you know, and I wanted it to be this kind of like this stealth moment, you know. But a couple of so it took me forever to get that recording done, and you know, it was primitive, and the microphone's all bumping around, and forgive me for that, but I thought it was really important that you hear that version of Catfish the way it was played and sung way back then. And then I seam that with a version of me playing it on electric guitar.
Right.
And what I did when I was at that Chester homestead, because I have experience in a lot of recording, I did that with my foot on that porch, and I could hear the medicine bottles inside that cabinet just rattling. I could hear the silverware in that kitchen just rattling. And then, of course, the wonderful resonance and that sort of bass response of the porch in and of itself. And I just made a recording of that thumping. And then when I came back to New York City, to St. Louis, I put that, I did a time loop of me playing that thumping. So I played to that loop. Mm-hmm. So I took modern technology and I married it to a recording of me exactly as I would have sounded in 1929 when that banjo was first made. So my foot stomping was 1929, but I bring it together with an electronic loop from 2020. And I just thought that was an interesting little marriage of the old and the new.
Yeah, and so, it sounds totally natural, like nobody would know that.
Nobody would. Yeah. But Stephen, they have, you could go to a music store these days and buy these things called porch boxes.
Right.
You know, they have a little guitar plug on them, and it's a little, you know, a microphone pickup inside of it. And the whole concept is that it sounds like a porch. Well, I was on a porch.
Right.
I was on the porch from 1921, one of the most quintessential porches that's available to us right now, because it was the same porch that was there around the turn of the century, all the way to when folks were kicked out of the Okefenokee. And I want to make one more thing really clear here about the Okefenokee Swamp, is that I think it could accurately be described as the East Coast of the United States' last frontier, because there were, up until 1929, I mean, in mid-1920s, there were parts of that swamp that nobody had ever seen. Now, 1929, you know, every place else in the East Coast had already, most of the trees had been cut down, and you know, everybody had kind of mapped it all out by that point in the U.S., in the eastern part of the U.S. And there's a ranger out there who's been very helpful to my research, and she said to me on my last trip, she says, "Walter, you know, there's a cypress stand that still nobody's been to." And I said, "Well, how do you know? If nobody's been to it, how do you know it exists?" And she says, "Because of drone photography. And we found some old growth 700-year-old cypress out there that was so deep in the swamp, it wasn't worth it for those guys to get to. and they never knew it was there because they didn't have drone photography, and they didn't use airplanes for that purpose back then. So anyway, and I said, well, is there a chance that I can go out and see it someday? And she says, we know where it's there, and I'll see if I can get you. I think I can get you a personal tour out there next time. So I really want to schedule that because, Stephen, they took 700-year-old cypresses that were big around as the redwoods, and they shaved the whole swamp bare.
Right.
On the other hand, you know, none of this music probably would have been. There wouldn't have been attention put on the swamp had it not been for the logging business.
Yeah.
And this guy might not have come down with this recording equipment, and I might not be talking to you now.
Right.
If they hadn't have done that logging out there, who knows? But anyway, that's my story on going out there to record. I also did some field hollering. I did go to, when I first heard the music in y'all's collection, I noticed that there was a long tail on the sound. When a man would go, "Yah," it would carry on. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. They didn't have special effects back then in 1945. There was no such a thing as reverb or any of that. And it took me a couple of listens to key into that. And then I went out to the ranger station a couple of years later, and she said, one of the rangers said, you know, it carries like that. And I'm like, nah, come on. And so I took an assistant out to the swamp, and I had a little battery powered recording unit, and I got him to position himself a half mile away, and I drove down the road and I sang, and sure enough, it sounds like the cathedrals in France or something. It has this long sound. And I think that's because, you know, I've got a couple of pencils here. I didn't save them for that reason, but in that part of the country, the trees kind of, I'll put it on the, here you go. The trees kind of look like this. The leaves and everything are up top. I mean, the branches are up top, but the trunks of the trees could be 40, 50 feet high, and they're just bare. My point is there's no branches on the lower part of the trees. So those trees kind of serve as a spring, as an echo chamber. And it's beautiful. You can hear it. I recorded it on the tape that I did for you guys, and I demonstrated that. And that was a big thrill to just hear it. And what's weird is it has this carry to it for miles. It's a double tree, because there's something about the trees, they echo it back to you, but they carry it. It's a phenomenon that I'm not scientific enough to understand, but maybe that'll be part of my research as the years roll by.
Yeah, no, it is amazing. And, you know, you think about it, and you're right. If the leaves were further down, they'd break up that sound. But
it'd be dead.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, so one thing that I want to sort of go back and fill in, because we've talked about you're learning viola and you're learning guitar, but we didn't actually talk about the banjo and when you decided to make that jump too, to learning the banjo, because you're a good banjo player, man.
Oh, well, thanks. Well, I'm really a guitar player, and this is going to totally discredit me in the folk world, but remember when I said earlier in this interview that I'll just say yes and figure out how to do it yet later? And, when somebody asked me to sing at their wedding initially, I said, oh yeah, I'll do that. And I didn't really even know how to sing, but I taught myself to sing. I've been playing banjo for years, and I love the banjo. And I realized two things about the banjo. First of all, I had to accept it as something that was, I had to embrace it as something that I would allow myself to play, because the banjo forever used to symbolize the all the negative connotations of being a rural Southerner, and there are those connotations, the banjo was part and parcel with that stereotyping. And I bought into it even as a Southerner. So I had to, I realized that, well, first of all, I had to accept it as an instrument that I would be willing to be seen with, you know,
Right.
because there's so many bad
Right.
banjo jokes and everything. But I did not start a love for the banjo because of folk music. My interest in banjo was through jazz, actually. And banjo plays an intricate part of Dixieland music.
Sure.
And in trying to find employment as a young man in Florida, I started a Dixieland jazz band.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody else in my town could play that type of banjo. Given that I grew up in North Florida, there were plenty of 5-string banjo players who played bluegrass, but I could find none who played ragtime style banjo, which is more picking. It's kind of like what they do in the Mummers Parade in Philadelphia and that kind of thing in that area. But so it was the New Orleans ragtime kind of vibe is what introduced me to banjo. And I had to find a banjo that was 4-string. It's a tenor banjo is what I'm playing on. Now, I have a feeling, well, it's not a feeling. I know that a lot of the banjos that were played in those southern areas, given that they had the Appalachian influence, they were 5-string banjos. Mm-hmm. There's a picture of Hamp Mizell in the Okefenokee playing a 5-string banjo. I've found no evidence of any 4-string tenor banjo players. Nonetheless, that's what I play, and that's what I like to play. And my attachment to that instrument came through jazz, Stephen, actually. But so that was a survival mode. And when I first, for a point in my life, I moved to Nashville, and one of the things that I did for extra money when I moved to Nashville was I started recording live bands, and I would do live field recordings of string bands and contradance bands and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And you know this about life. When you immerse yourself in something, you kind of start to appreciate it on a level, and all your prejudices kind of go away about it. And again, because of the reasons that I confessed to you of feeling like I was elitely above most rural Southern folk music, I had no use for contradance music until I started recording it. Mm-hmm. And I started listening to this great songs like Red Wing and those sorts of things. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. And it just loops and loops, and you get more into this mental froth, you just get more delivered, and you go on this journey as a dancer more and more every time the song goes around. And I started contradancing, and it's like I started to understand that culture. And so I began to experiment a little bit with clawhammer banjo, which I still don't have, but I realized that the banjo the banjo is a humbling instrument, because if you try to play the banjo, if you try to play that notey stuff that I'm doing in the recording for you, and you try to do it really hard, it loses all of its tone. You know, if you just slam into a banjo, it turns to mush. It's just like, it sounds like a metal coffee can with paper clips in it or something. Right. It has no beauty to it. But if you just, my banjo's over there, but if you have to play a banjo sort of delicately to get the tone out of it. And that kind of imposition, that when I found that the banjo had a set of rules I had to follow, yeah, that little humbling made me respect it a lot more. And then I started translating the swamp music to the banjo, and in a sense bringing that music back home, because I think, it's no secret that the banjo is originally an adaptation of an African instrument. And so I think that, oddly enough, I think my usage of a very simple banjo, a more simpler banjo, given the 4-string, and given that the banjo, they think, came to the what's now known as the United States, mostly through the Gullah Islands off South Carolina, and from that area, maybe there's some meaning to me just kind of bringing it back to that area in some sense. I mean, I don't play country and bluegrass style banjo, but what I did with that song Catfish is I learned this Appalachian style of playing because, as I said in the movie that I did for you guys, it was quoted by one of the old timers in the Okefenokee: if you can't play Catfish, you're not a banjo player. So I took it upon myself to learn that, and it was hard. That song is tricky, and it's I didn't play it that well on the porch, but I played it really well when I followed it up with that recording in my studio. So the recording that I submitted to y'all, it's the real thing. And there's a couple of times when I kind of trip up a little bit, but y'all forgive me for it because that was real, and there were mosquitoes biting me, and the heat was so unbearable. But I got through it, and but I think it was a pretty realistic portrayal.
It sounded great to us, so we had no complaints.
Oh, good.
And generally, the whole concert was kind of an amazing job that you did to put all that stuff together in a way that, as I said, you saw the whole at home aspect of this concert series as an opportunity to do stuff that you couldn't have done if you came to the library to do it, and we really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And that brings me to to another question that I know that you have also been a concert presenter and have run some concert series. So talk about that experience and what some of the artists that you presented and that experience.
Well, the most important aspect of this is that I got to the point. I lived in Jersey City I moved to Jersey City because I got hired to play with Richie Havens. And at the time, Richie Havens was living in Jersey City. And I thought, I'm going to make myself more indispensable, as much as a human being can make oneself indispensable, if I lived near him.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that strategy paid off because every day Richie was over at my house and we were rehearsing when we were not on the road. Generally, almost every day we got together and rehearsed in my studio. But there was a point that I just got tired of living in the shadow of New York City. There's so much of everything there. It's just, I love the neighborhood. I still love the neighborhood, but I had to leave. And I went to Savannah, Georgia for a couple of years. And I really got back in touch with my roots. And that's when I began my research on the Okefenokee Swamp. So, but I still had property in Jersey City. And when I left Savannah to come back to Jersey City, I said to myself, my wife and I said to ourselves, no more complaining. No more complaining about the shadow of New York City, the chaos of Jersey City, and how we're kind of culturally a fish out of the water, and how we're the artists in the community, and it's mostly a working class community. What are we going to do about the community to make it a place that we would want to live? So we started giving concerts in our loft, free concerts to the general public. We would have jazz concerts, opera concerts, classical music concerts. We would hire ballet dancers. And then the concert series grew so much that we couldn't do them in our loft anymore. And the public was coming to our house 4 times a year, every quarter, for these free concerts that we were giving. And we were hiring the musicians, and it was a great thing for the musicians. It was great for the community. Nobody paid for them. I mean, the general public didn't have to pay to come to see them, and that's very important to me. And we started looking for another space, and we had noticed this abandoned bridge in Jersey City that had been cordoned off. The city wasn't using the roadway underneath the bridge for traffic because it was a cobblestone street and they deemed it too unsafe. And so we got the city's permission to do a concert series under a 50-foot long street that has an arched roof for 50 feet. It's got a wonderful arched roof. I'm trying to get it right there we go. It's kind of like a cavern that goes 50 feet long. It's open on both ends because it's a tunnel. So we did this concert series, and the first one we did had a ballet dancer. I wrote the music for it. Then we had a Baroque classical quartet, and then we had an opera singer from Brazil or something. And people were just blown away, and we did it every year. Fast forward 4 more years, we came up with a name for the concert series. We called it the Vault Allure, the lure of the vault allure. We got a major sponsor in Nokia Bell Labs, and we grew from having an audience of 1,000, an audience of 100 to an audience of 1,000. And I had 2 prerequisites or 2 adages that I lived by, is that I wanted the concerts to be three adages. I wanted the concerts to be free to the general public. I wanted the performers to play in the round so that the audience could encircle the musicians or the dancers and feel the power and hear the power that the musicians were feeling and hearing. And I also wanted to present classical forms of music or forms of music that were not largely popular. We presented opera music, we presented ballet, we presented some blues, some jazz music, like a Savannah swing jazz kind of band. We would bring fire dancers in from different areas of the country. And this was just stuff it was just musical entertainment that people had never had access to. Because keep in mind, for the most part, Jersey City still is a working class neighborhood. If the only time these folks will see ballet is in a magazine.
Yeah.
And they're not going to go to Lincoln Center and pay $100 or $200 a ticket. So we brought ballet to this neighborhood. And rather than just perform something like Swan Lake or something with tutus, I would they would be dancing in front of this imaged map, highly technical projections on the walls of a cobblestone wall that was built during the WPA era. So each one of those Belgian block bricks was a different image map that a computer could project a different image onto, in front of which was a classical ballet dancer or a classical singer, opera singer. My point is that I presented in a modern way old music. And people were saying to me, I never knew this music had such a sensual allure to it. And I go, well, yeah, because you can feel it now, finally. And it's being presented to you in a way that you can understand it. So we're very proud of that. We didn't have one this year because of the COVID, but I'm working, we're still working with it. And, people can go to the website, vaultallure.com, and see what's up with it. And I'm also doing a project called the Unlawful Assembly, which is spiritual music. It's a mixed race band. 2 of us are white guys, and the rest there's 4 black members of the group, and we're just playing historical American spirituals, hymns, work songs, and hollers. And it's a wonderful way to present the soundtrack of the making of this country in a way that has no political agenda, no spiritual agenda. It's just here's what was going on when we were making this place. And this was the soundtrack. This is what, it doesn't matter if you were working in the fields or if you were praying in the churches. What was the music that was going on concurrently to all of that? And it's a beautiful project. And I'm also, I'm rehearsing with that, and I'm kind of weaving the work that I've done for the Library of Congress into that project, because at the end of the day, I think there's a very spiritual power to some of these hollers, and the shape note singing that was sung in the Okefenokee also works well with this Unlawful Assembly band that I have. So it's all of this is going on, and I'm still I'm still I'm itching to perform again on the road. So
thank you so much for all you've done for us and with our material. And I should say, just for the audience, that collection is the Francis Harper Collection of Music of the Okefenokee Region. And Walter Parks's concert can be found on the Library of Congress website at loc.gov. Just search on his name, Walter Parks, and you will find the concert as well. So thank you so much, Walter. I see you have your guitar with us. Do you want to play us something to take us out?
Yeah, I'll just play a little quick quick holler. And I will say that, again, I want to drive home the point that my research work that was made possible because of what the Library of Congress has preserved, has the research, the music that I've researched has changed me forever, and has shaped how I perform and what I perform for the rest of my career. And I don't remember if it was Toronto or where I was, Montreal or some other city, when I first met you at a table at the Folk Alliance. I just had a great feeling that we shared a passion. We shared a passion for research and historical music. And I'm so glad that you took an interest in what I'm doing. And so I'm indebted to you. And I've chosen to sing a little bit of a holler called the Coming Home Holler. Well, I'm coming home again. I'm bound to see my kin, but I don't know who'll be waiting by and by. I pray they let me in, 'cause I'm tired of wandering. I don't know if I'll make it by and by. I don't know if I'll make it by and by. No, I don't know who'll be waiting by and by. I'm coming home again.
Walter Parks, thank you so much.
My pleasure. That was old school mixing there. I hope it sounded all right.